When you ask yourself who you really are, what is it that persists through all your changing thoughts, aging body, and evolving personality? This question has haunted humanity for millennia. The concept of the soul represents one of philosophy's oldest and most contested attempts to answer it. The soul is not merely a religious idea, though religion has certainly shaped its meaning. It is a philosophical puzzle that cuts to the heart of what it means to be human. Throughout history, thinkers have asked, are we purely physical beings, or is there something immaterial that makes us who we are? If you lose your memories, are you still you? What makes you the same person you were 10 years ago, or will be 10 years from now? These are not abstract games for intellectuals. How we answer the question of the soul determines how we think about death, personal responsibility, artificial intelligence, the treatment of those in comas, and even whether punishment or rehabilitation makes sense for criminals. If there is no soul, are we just complex biological machines? If there is a soul, what is it made of, and how does it interact with our physical brain? This investigation will not give you easy answers, because none exist. Instead, we will explore the full landscape of this profound question, examining the most rigorous arguments from both ancient and contemporary philosophy, the empirical challenges from neuroscience, and the practical implications that affect how we live our lives. Part 1. What the soul is supposed to be. Before we can evaluate whether souls exist, we must understand what philosophers actually mean when they use this word. The soul is not one concept, but many competing concepts that have evolved across cultures and centuries. At its most fundamental level, the soul is proposed as the principle of life and identity. It is meant to explain two seemingly simple but profoundly difficult questions. What makes living things alive, and what makes you, specifically, you? Let us start with the first question, the soul as the principle of life. When you look at a living dog and a dead dog, something has changed beyond the mere physical arrangement of matter. Ancient thinkers observed this and concluded there must be some animating principle, something that makes the difference between a corpse and a living being. The Greek word for soul, psyche, literally meant breath or life force. The Latin word anima carries the same connotation, related to animation and breath. This might seem primitive to modern ears, but the underlying question remains challenging. What is the difference between living and non-living matter? We now know about cellular respiration, metabolism, and homeostasis, but these are descriptions of what life does, not explanations of what life fundamentally is. The soul concept was an early attempt to identify that special something that separates the animate from the inanimate. But the soul was never just about basic biological life. If it were, we would have to say that bacteria have souls, and most philosophical traditions have reserved the soul for something more significant. The soul became tied to a second, deeper question: personal identity. What makes you the same person over time, despite constant physical and mental change? Consider this carefully. The cells in your body are almost entirely replaced every 7 to 10 years. Your thoughts, memories, and personality shift continuously throughout your life. You are not the same physically or mentally as you were as a child. Yet you have a persistent sense of being the same individual, the same I, that exists through all these transformations. The soul was proposed as the stable, unchanging substrate that provides this continuity. The philosopher John Locke illustrated this problem brilliantly with a thought experiment about a prince and a cobbler. Imagine a prince and a cobbler switch souls, so the prince's soul now inhabits the cobbler's body and vice versa. Who is who? If the person with the cobbler's body now has all the prince's memories, personality and sense of identity, is he the prince or the cobbler? Most people's intuitions say he is the prince in the cobbler's body. This intuition suggests we believe something beyond the physical body determines who we are. Now let us examine the third traditional function of the soul: consciousness and subjective experience. When you taste chocolate or feel sadness or see the colour red, you have a private subjective experience. Philosophers call this phenomenal consciousness, the what it is like quality of experience. The soul has been proposed as the seat of this inner experiential life. It is not just that you process information like a computer might, but that there is something it feels like to be you from the inside. This subjective dimension creates what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. We can explain in physical terms how the brain processes sensory information, forms memories, and controls behavior. These are the easy problems, relatively speaking. But no amount of information about neurons firing seems to explain why there should be any subjective experience at all. Why does the brain produce the inner movie of consciousness rather than simply processing information in the dark? The soul concept attempted to bridge this explanatory gap. The fourth traditional aspect of the soul concerns moral agency and rationality. Many philosophers, particularly in the Western tradition following Plato and Aristotle, saw the soul as the source of our capacity for rational thought and moral judgment. What separates humans from animals in this view is not just consciousness, but rational consciousness, the ability to grasp abstract truths and make moral decisions. The soul is what makes us moral agents capable of good and evil, praise and blame. Aristotle divided the soul into different levels. Plants have a nutritive soul that governs growth and reproduction. Animals have a sensitive soul that adds perception and locomotion. Humans have a rational soul that includes all previous functions but adds the capacity for abstract reasoning and moral deliberation. This hierarchical view attempted to explain both what humans share with other living things and what makes us unique. Finally, the soul has been linked to immortality and transcendence. If the soul is immaterial, if it is not made of physical stuff, then perhaps it does not decay when the body dies. This is not merely wishful thinking about an afterlife. It follows from a logical argument. Physical things decompose because they are composed of parts that can separate. If the soul has no parts, if it is simple and indivisible, then it cannot decompose. Therefore, the reasoning goes, it must be immortal. But we must be careful here. Not all philosophical traditions that posit a soul believe in personal immortality. Some Buddhist schools, for instance, accept a kind of soul or self while denying it persists individually after death. And some Western philosophers who believe in souls are agnostic about their survival. The connection between soul and immortality is common but not necessary. Let us synthesize these functions. The soul, in classical philosophy, is proposed as an immaterial, indivisible principle that animates the body, provides continuity of personal identity, generates conscious experience, enables rational and moral thought, and potentially survives bodily death. It is meant to be the real you, the essential core that makes you a unique individual rather than just a collection of atoms or a series of mental states. But this creates immediate problems. If the soul is immaterial, how does it interact with the physical body? If it has no parts, how can it contain memories or have different aspects like reason and emotion? If it is separate from the brain, why does brain damage affect personality, memory, and consciousness? These questions will drive much of our investigation. The concept of the soul, we must recognize, was born from genuine philosophical puzzles that remain unsolved. Modern neuroscience has not eliminated the mystery of consciousness. Evolutionary biology has not fully explained the sense of unified selfhood. Whether the soul, as classically conceived, exists is debatable, but the problems it was invented to solve remain very much alive. Part 2. Classical Arguments for the Soul. The ancient Greeks gave us the first systematic philosophical arguments for the soul's existence, and these arguments remain influential today. We must examine them not as historical curiosities, but as living ideas that still shape how people think about consciousness and identity. Plato provided what may be the most famous argument for the soul in his dialogue Phaedo, where Socrates awaits execution and discusses immortality with his students. Plato was not merely asserting that souls exist. He was constructing rational arguments meant to withstand scrutiny. Plato's first major argument is called the argument from opposites. He observed that things in nature come from their opposites. The tall comes from the short, the hot from the cold, sleeping from waking. Life and death, he reasoned, must follow this same pattern. If death comes from life, then life must come from death. Therefore, the soul must survive death to be reborn, cycling between the living and dead states. This argument may seem weak to modern readers because it relies on a pattern that does not actually hold universally. Not everything comes from its opposite. Heat can come from friction, not just from cold. But Plato was attempting something sophisticated, finding natural laws that might apply to the soul. More powerful is Plato's argument from recollection. He noticed that people can grasp abstract concepts like perfect equality, perfect justice, or perfect beauty, even though we never encounter these perfections in the physical world. No two sticks are perfectly equal. No action is perfectly just. Yet we understand what perfect equality means and can judge that actual things fall short of it. Where did this knowledge come from? Plato argued that we must have encountered these perfect forms before birth, when our souls existed in a realm of pure ideas. Learning, therefore, is actually recollection, remembering what the soul knew before being embodied. This argument reveals something important about Plato's conception of the soul. The soul is not merely alive or conscious. It is fundamentally rational and connected to eternal truths. The physical world is one of constant change and imperfection. The realm of forms, where souls originate, is eternal and perfect. The soul's true home is not the body, but this realm of pure reason and truth. Our current embodied state is almost like imprisonment or exile from our true nature. Plato's most sophisticated argument is the argument from affinity. He divided all things into two categories: the composite and the simple, the visible and the invisible, the changing and the unchanging. The body is clearly composite, visible, and constantly changing. It is made of parts that will separate at death. The soul, by contrast, is simple, invisible, and unchanging in its essence. Things decompose because they have parts that can be separated. What has no parts cannot decompose. Therefore, the soul must be immortal and indestructible. This argument remains influential because it connects the immateriality of the soul to its potential immortality through logical necessity. If you accept that the soul is non-physical and simple, immortality follows naturally. The question, of course, is whether we should accept that initial premise. Plato also gave us the tripartite theory of the soul, which profoundly influenced later psychology. He argued the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason seeks truth and wisdom. Spirit seeks honor and can feel righteous anger. Appetite seeks physical pleasures like food, drink, and sex. These three parts often conflict within us. You might know you should diet, but your appetite wants dessert. Your reason might tell you to flee danger, but your spirit feels you should fight for honor. This model explains internal psychological conflict in a way that feels intuitively right. We do seem to have different motivational systems that pull us in different directions. Plato argued that virtue consists in harmony among these parts, with reason ruling like a charioteer guiding two horses. This is not merely ancient speculation. Modern psychology recognizes similar divisions in cognitive architecture, though we explain them differently. The prefrontal cortex associated with executive function and rational planning, the limbic system associated with emotions and social drives, and the brain stem and hypothalamus associated with basic appetites map roughly onto Plato's model. Now we turn to Aristotle, Plato's student, who revolutionized the concept of the soul while rejecting much of his teacher's metaphysics. Aristotle was more empirically minded, more interested in biological observation than abstract mathematical forms. Aristotle defined the soul as the form of a living body, the principle that organizes matter into a functioning organism. This is his famous hylomorphic theory, from the Greek words for matter and form. Every physical thing is a combination of matter and form. A bronze statue is bronze shaped into a particular form. A living thing is physical matter organized by the soul's form. The soul is not a separate substance inhabiting the body like a ghost in a machine. It is the active organizing principle that makes the body what it is. Consider a knife. The matter is metal. The form is the arrangement that makes it capable of cutting. The knife's form is not a separate thing from the metal. It is the way the metal is organized to perform its function. Similarly, the soul is not separate from the body, but is the organization and functional capacity of the living body. Just as there is no knifeness existing independently of actual knives, there is no soul existing independently of living bodies. This has radical implications. If the soul just is the organization of the body, then when the body dies and that organization dissolves, the soul ceases to exist. Aristotle did not believe in personal immortality in the Platonic sense. However, he thought the rational part of the soul, what he called the active intellect, might be immortal because it engages with eternal truths. This aspect of his thought is obscure and disputed by scholars. What is clear is that Aristotle rejected the idea of the soul as a separate, pre-existing entity. Aristotle's biological observations led him to recognize different levels of soul. Plants have souls that enable nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Animals have souls that add sensation, desire, and locomotion. Humans have souls that add rational thought and deliberation. Each higher level includes the capacities of the lower levels. A human soul does everything a plant soul does, plus everything an animal soul does, plus rational thinking. This hierarchical model attempted to explain both the continuity and discontinuity between different forms of life. We share some capacities with plants and animals, but we also have something distinctive. The question of exactly where to draw these lines remains controversial. Do insects have souls? Do they have consciousness? What about fish or birds? Aristotle was grappling with questions that neuroscience and philosophy of mind still debate today. Medieval Christian, Jewish and Islamic philosophers adapted and synthesized these Greek arguments. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the greatest medieval philosopher, attempted to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. He accepted Aristotle's view that the soul is the form of the body, but he also needed to account for Christian doctrines of personal immortality and bodily resurrection. Aquinas argued that while the soul is naturally the form of the body, it can exist separately after death because of its rational nature. The intellect's capacity to grasp universal truths shows that it transcends purely material processes. Therefore, the rational soul can survive bodily death. However, this separated state is unnatural and incomplete. The soul naturally desires to be reunited with a body, which explains the Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection at the end of time. Full human existence requires both body and soul together. This synthesis attempted to preserve both philosophical rigor and religious doctrine. The soul is not a Platonic prisoner of the body, but the body's natural form, yet it has capacities that allow it to transcend physical death. Whether this synthesis succeeds is debatable. Critics argue that if the soul truly is the form of the body, it cannot exist without the body any more than the shape of a statue can exist without the bronze. Defenders argue that rational capacities are different in kind from biological functions and therefore can survive independently. Islamic philosophers like Avicenna provided another crucial argument, the flying man thought experiment. Imagine you are created suddenly in mid-air, unable to see or feel anything, with no sensory input whatsoever. You have no experience of your body or the external world. Would you still be aware of your own existence? Avicenna argued yes. You would still have self-awareness, a sense of I exist, even without any bodily sensations. This shows that self-awareness does not depend on the body. Therefore, the self or soul must be something distinct from the physical body. This argument anticipates Descartes' famous cogito by 6 centuries. It appeals to the apparent immediacy and certainty of self-awareness. Even in the absence of all physical sensations, consciousness of one's own existence persists. Critics respond that this thought experiment may be incoherent. Can we really imagine consciousness without any physical substrate? Is self-awareness actually independent of embodied experience, or does it only seem that way from the first-person perspective? All these classical arguments share common strategies. They try to identify features of mental life that seem to transcend physical explanation. Our grasp of abstract truths, the unity of consciousness, self-awareness, moral reasoning, and the persistence of identity through change. They argue from these mental phenomena to the existence of an immaterial soul. Whether these inferences are valid depends on whether mental phenomena genuinely cannot be explained in physical terms, a question that remains fiercely contested. Part 3. The Cartesian Revolution and Dualism. René Descartes transformed the soul debate in the 17th century by grounding it in radical skepticism and mathematical certainty. His approach was revolutionary because he tried to build philosophy from the ground up, doubting everything that could be doubted until he reached something indubitable. Descartes began with methodological doubt. He realized that his senses sometimes deceived him. He had experienced dreams that seemed real while dreaming. He could not entirely rule out the possibility that an evil demon was deceiving him about everything. What could he know with absolute certainty? His answer is perhaps philosophy's most famous line: "I think, therefore I am." Even if everything else is illusion, the very act of doubting proves that he exists as a thinking thing. To doubt, you must exist. But what is this I that exists? Descartes concluded he is essentially a thinking thing, a mind or soul, and that this is more certain than the existence of his body. He could doubt whether he had a body, but he could not doubt that he was thinking. Therefore, the mind must be distinct from the body. The essence of mind is thought, consciousness, awareness. The essence of body is extension, taking up space in 3 dimensions. This is substance dualism, the view that reality consists of 2 fundamentally different kinds of substance, mental and physical. The mind or soul is an immaterial thinking substance. The body is a material extended substance. These are not just different properties of one thing, but entirely different types of things. The mind has no size, shape, or location in physical space. The body has no thoughts, feelings, or consciousness. Descartes provided several arguments for this radical separation. First is the argument from doubt we just discussed. I can doubt I have a body, but not that I have a mind. Therefore, mind and body must be different. Second is the argument from clear and distinct ideas. We can clearly and distinctly conceive of mind without body and body without mind. Whatever we can clearly conceive as separate must actually be separable. Therefore, mind and body are truly distinct substances. Third is the argument from divisibility. The body is divisible into parts. You can lose a limb and still exist. The mind, by contrast, seems indivisible. You cannot split consciousness in half or remove part of your mind the way you remove part of your body. Since mind and body have contradictory properties, one divisible and one not, they cannot be the same thing. Fourth is the argument from the nature of thought itself. Physical things, Descartes argued, operate mechanically according to deterministic laws. Animals are complex biological machines, like sophisticated clockwork. But human thought is creative, flexible, and unlimited in ways that mechanical systems cannot match. We can understand and respond appropriately to an infinite variety of situations. We can use language creatively to express novel thoughts. No mechanical system, no matter how complex, could do this. Therefore, human thought requires something beyond the physical, an immaterial soul. Descartes was writing at the dawn of modern science, when the mechanical worldview was replacing Aristotelian teleology. He fully embraced the idea that the physical world operates like a machine, according to mathematical laws. But he saw consciousness as the one thing that could not be mechanized. The soul was his way of protecting human uniqueness and free will in an increasingly mechanistic universe. However, Cartesian dualism immediately faces what philosophers call the interaction problem. If mind and body are completely different substances with nothing in common, how do they interact? How does your decision to raise your arm cause physical muscles to contract? How do physical events like light hitting your retina cause mental experiences of seeing colours? Causal interaction seems to require some point of contact, some shared nature between cause and effect. But immaterial minds have no location in space and no physical properties. Descartes struggled with this problem throughout his life. In his meditations, he suggested that mind and body interact at the pineal gland, a small structure in the centre of the brain. He chose this because it is singular, while most brain structures come in pairs, and because its function was unknown in his time. But this solution does not really solve the problem. Even if we identify a physical location for interaction, we still have not explained how an immaterial mind influences matter or how matter affects an immaterial mind. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of Descartes' most astute correspondents, pressed him on exactly this point. She wrote, "How can the soul of a man determine the spirits of his body so as to produce voluntary actions, being only a thinking substance? For it seems that all determination of movement is produced by the pushing of the thing moved, by the manner in which it is pushed by that which moves it, or else by the particular qualities and shape of the surface of the latter. Physical contact is required for the first two conditions, and extension for the third. You entirely exclude extension from your notion of the soul, and contact seems to me incompatible with an immaterial thing." This criticism is devastating. Elizabeth is pointing out that in the mechanical physics Descartes himself endorsed, all causation works through contact and motion. But immaterial souls cannot make contact with anything physical. Descartes never provided a satisfactory answer. He eventually responded to Elizabeth that we should simply accept from experience that mind and body do interact, even if we cannot fully understand how. But this is philosophically unsatisfying. The interaction problem led later philosophers to explore alternative forms of dualism that avoid direct causal interaction. Occasionalism, defended by philosophers like Nicolas Malebranche, argued that mind and body do not actually interact at all. When you decide to raise your arm, God occasions the physical event of your arm rising. Every apparent mind-body interaction is actually God coordinating the two separate substances. This preserves dualism, but at the cost of making God a constant micromanager of every thought and action in the universe. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz proposed a different solution called pre-established harmony. God created mind and body to run in perfect parallel like two synchronized clocks. When you decide to raise your arm, your body was pre-programmed from creation to raise the arm at exactly that moment. Mind and body never actually interact, but they appear to because God coordinated them perfectly in advance. This is philosophically ingenious but scientifically implausible. It requires denying that mental events truly cause physical events or vice versa. Despite these problems, Substance dualism has significant philosophical appeal. It seems to match our subjective experience of having a private inner life distinct from the public physical world. It explains the apparent unity of consciousness, the sense that all your experiences belong to a single subject. It provides a clear account of personal identity over time, since the immaterial soul persists while the body changes. And it preserves the possibility of life after death, since an immaterial soul could exist when the body perishes. Moreover, Descartes identified real phenomena that physical science struggles to explain even today. Consciousness does seem qualitatively different from anything in the physical world. Subjective experience, the redness of red, or the painfulness of pain, is not obviously reducible to neural activity. The flexibility and creativity of human thought still distinguishes us from artificial intelligence. Free will and moral responsibility seem to require something beyond deterministic physical processes. Modern neuroscience has not eliminated these puzzles, though it has complicated the dualist picture. We now know the brain is vastly more complex than Descartes imagined. We have mapped correlations between specific brain regions and mental functions. Damage to different brain areas produces predictable changes in personality, memory, language, and even moral reasoning. This suggests that mental properties depend intimately on physical brain states in ways that seem hard to reconcile with an independent immaterial soul. Yet defenders of dualism argue that correlation is not identity. Just because brain states correlate with mental states does not prove they are the same thing. A television set is correlated with the programs it displays, but the programs are not identical to the television circuits. Perhaps the brain is more like a radio receiving signals from an immaterial mind than like the mind itself. This is called transmission theory, and it has some contemporary defenders, though it faces significant challenges. A more sophisticated contemporary form of dualism is property dualism. This view accepts that there is only one kind of substance, physical substance, but argues that this substance can have two irreducibly different kinds of properties, physical properties and mental properties. Consciousness emerges from complex physical systems like brains, but conscious experiences have properties that are not reducible to or explainable in terms of physical properties. The redness of red is a real property of your experience, but it is not identical to any physical property of neurons or wavelengths of light. Property dualism tries to capture what seems right about Cartesian intuitions while avoiding the interaction problem. There is only one world, the physical world, so there is no mystery about how mind and body interact. They are aspects of the same thing. But consciousness represents a genuinely new kind of property that emerges from physical complexity, irreducible to the physical properties from which it emerges. This position is held by many contemporary philosophers who reject materialism but want to avoid the implausibilities of substance dualism. The Cartesian legacy endures not because his specific form of dualism is widely accepted, but because he identified the central problem clearly. Consciousness seems fundamentally different from physical processes. How we explain this difference or explain it away remains philosophy's deepest challenge. Part 4. Materialist challenges and arguments against the soul. Not everyone was convinced by arguments for an immaterial soul, even in ancient times. Materialist philosophers argued that everything, including mind and consciousness, is ultimately physical. Understanding materialism is essential because it represents the dominant view in contemporary science and philosophy. The earliest materialists were Greek atomists like Democritus and Leucippus in the 5th century before the Common Era. They proposed that reality consists of atoms, indivisible particles moving through void space. Everything that exists is made of atoms. Atoms combine in different arrangements to create different things: rocks, trees, animals, humans. The soul is not a separate immaterial substance, but rather a special arrangement of particularly fine, smooth, fast-moving atoms distributed throughout the body. This was a radical proposal for its time. Democritus argued that thought and sensation are physical processes. When atoms from external objects enter our sensory organs, they interact with soul atoms to produce perception. When we think, soul atoms are moving and colliding in particular patterns. Death occurs when the soul atoms dissipate and scatter. There is no afterlife because the soul is not unified or immaterial, just a temporary configuration of matter. The Roman philosopher Lucretius, in his poem On the Nature of Things, provided the most systematic defense of ancient atomism. He argued explicitly against the immortality of the soul. The soul grows with the body in childhood, weakens with age, and is affected by disease and injury. This proves the soul is corporeal and mortal. If the soul were immaterial and immortal, these physical factors should not affect it. Lucretius also pointed out logical problems with pre-existence and reincarnation. If souls existed before birth, why do we have no memory of previous lives? If souls were to survive death and enter new bodies, why is there no experience of the transition? The simplest explanation is that the soul is generated with the body and dies with the body. Death is nothing to fear, because when we are dead, we do not exist to experience anything. These ancient materialist arguments are surprisingly modern. They appeal to empirical observation, parsimony, and logical consistency rather than mystical intuition. They anticipate contemporary neuroscience in recognizing that mental states depend on physical states. The scientific revolution of the 17th century gave materialism new momentum. As physics, chemistry, and biology progressed, more and more phenomena that had seemed mysterious were explained in purely physical terms. Lightning was not divine anger, but electrical discharge. Disease was not demonic possession, but infection by microorganisms. The heart was not the seat of emotions, but a pump for blood circulation. Life itself was not a special vital force, but biochemistry. If so many apparently non-physical phenomena turned out to be physical, perhaps consciousness would too. This is an argument from the track record of science. Throughout history, the domain of the immaterial or supernatural has steadily shrunk as science advanced. Gods were invoked to explain thunder, earthquakes, plague, and celestial motions. All these phenomena received natural physical explanations. The pattern suggests that consciousness, the last refuge of immateriality, will eventually be explained physically too. Thomas Hobbes, a contemporary of Descartes, explicitly rejected dualism and argued that thought is computation in a material brain. He wrote, "Life is but a motion of limbs. For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body?" Hobbes extended this mechanical view to the mind itself. Thinking is just the mechanical motion of parts of the brain. There is no ghost in the machine, only the machine itself. In the 18th century, French materialist Julien Offray de la Métrie published Man a Machine, arguing that humans are simply sophisticated organic machines. He pointed to evidence that mental states depend on physical states. Alcohol affects thought and mood. Brain injuries change personality. Mental illness responds to physical treatments. If an immaterial soul controlled the body, these physical interventions should not affect it. The fact that they do suggests the mind just is the brain in action. The 19th century brought Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which provided a naturalistic explanation for the origin of complex organisms, including humans. If humans evolved gradually from simpler organisms through natural selection, at what point did the immaterial soul appear? Did apes have souls? Did early hominids? Did Neanderthals? Drawing any sharp line seems arbitrary. The smooth continuum of evolutionary development makes it implausible that an immaterial soul suddenly appeared at some specific point. Moreover, evolution explained apparent design without needing a designer, and mental capacities without needing an immaterial mind. Complex behaviors in animals could be understood as adaptations shaped by natural selection. There was no need to invoke souls to explain why birds build nests or beavers build dams. If animal behavior is explicable in purely physical terms, why not human behavior too? We are, after all, animals ourselves, evolved from the same ancestors. 20th century neuroscience intensified the challenge to dualism. We discovered that specific brain regions perform specific mental functions. Damage to Broca's area impairs speech production. Damage to the hippocampus prevents formation of new memories. Damage to the frontal lobes changes personality and moral judgment. A patient named Phineas Gage, who survived an iron rod being driven through his frontal lobe, became a different person, more impulsive, less conscientious, unable to plan. If the immaterial soul is the seat of personality and rational thought, why does damaging the physical brain change these things? The dualist might respond that the brain is the instrument through which the soul operates, and damaging the instrument impairs its function. But this analogy breaks down under scrutiny. When you damage a piano, it produces distorted music, but the musician's knowledge and skill remain intact. With brain damage, it is not just that the person's expression is impaired, but that their knowledge, skill, and even their character actually change. This suggests these mental properties are properties of the brain itself, not of a separate soul using the brain. Split brain studies provide even more dramatic evidence. In severe epilepsy, surgeons sometimes cut the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the left and right brain hemispheres. This stops seizures from spreading, but produces bizarre effects. The two hemispheres can no longer communicate and begin to function independently. A split-brain patient shown an image to only the right visual field, processed by the left hemisphere where language is typically located, can describe what they see. But shown an image to only the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere, they cannot verbally describe it, though the right hemisphere clearly perceives it and can direct the left hand to point to matching objects. What does this mean for the soul? Do split-brain patients have two souls, one for each hemisphere? That seems absurd. Do they have one soul that is somehow split? But how can an immaterial, indivisible soul be split by cutting physical connections between brain hemispheres? The simpler explanation is that the unified sense of self is produced by integrated brain activity, and disrupting that integration fragments consciousness itself. Modern neuroscience can induce specific mental states by stimulating specific brain regions. Stimulating the temporal lobe can produce religious experiences or out-of-body sensations. Stimulating motor cortex makes you move without any conscious intention. Transcranial magnetic stimulation can temporarily disrupt moral judgment or enhance mathematical ability. If the soul is the source of religious experience, intentional action, and moral reasoning, why can these be manipulated by magnetic fields affecting the brain? Psychopharmacology provides similar evidence. Drugs that alter brain chemistry alter consciousness, mood, personality, and cognition. Anesthesia can completely shut down consciousness. Antidepressants can change how you experience emotions and evaluate your life. Psychedelics can produce profound mystical experiences or terrifying hallucinations. All this suggests that consciousness depends entirely on brain chemistry, not on an independent, immaterial soul. The materialist argument from neural dependence can be formulated precisely. For every mental state, M, there is a corresponding brain state B. Whenever B occurs, M occurs. Whenever M occurs, B occurs. Changes to B produce predictable changes to M. No instance of M has ever been observed without B. The most parsimonious explanation is that M just is B, or at minimum that M depends entirely on and is produced by B. This leaves no work for an immaterial soul to do. Materialists also invoke Occam's razor, the principle that we should not multiply entities beyond necessity. If we can explain all mental phenomena in terms of brain processes, why postulate an additional immaterial substance? Every time in history that science has explained something, the explanation has been physical. There is no reason to think consciousness will be different. Postulating an immaterial soul is like postulating phlogiston in chemistry or vital force in biology, unnecessary theoretical entities that science eventually eliminated. Contemporary materialism comes in different forms. Eliminative materialism, defended by philosophers like Paul and Patricia Churchland, argues that our ordinary mental concepts like beliefs, desires and sensations are prescientific folk psychology that will be replaced by neuroscientific concepts. Just as we no longer explain combustion with phlogiston, we will no longer explain behavior with beliefs and desires. These mental states do not really exist as distinct entities. They are crude approximations that will be eliminated by better science. Reductive materialism argues that mental states do exist, but are identical to brain states. Pain is identical to C-fiber firing in the brain. Seeing red is identical to a specific pattern of neural activation in visual cortex. Mental properties are not eliminated but reduced to physical properties. Just as water is identical to H2O molecules, mental states are identical to brain states. Everything that exists is physical, and mind is no exception. Functionalism, developed by philosophers like Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor, offers a more subtle materialist view. Mental states are not identical to specific brain states, but are defined by their functional role, their causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states. Pain is whatever state is typically caused by injury and typically causes avoidance behavior and distress. This functional role could potentially be realized in different physical substrates. Human brains, alien brains, or silicon computers could all instantiate the same mental states if they have the right functional organization. This view is materialist because it denies immaterial souls, but it is less reductive than type identity theory. The materialist picture has powerful advantages. It is scientifically respectable, consistent with everything we know about physics, chemistry, and biology. It explains why mental states depend on brain states. It fits with evolutionary theory and avoids the dualist interaction problem. It is ontologically economical, positing only one kind of substance rather than two. And it has the entire predictive success of neuroscience behind it. However, materialism faces significant challenges that prevent it from being universally accepted. The hard problem of consciousness, which we will explore in depth, asks how and why physical processes produce subjective experience. Many philosophers argue that no amount of information about neurons explains what it feels like to see red. Materialists also struggle to account for intentionality, the aboutness of mental states. How can purely physical states be about other things, represent things, or mean things? A neuron firing is just a physical event, not inherently about anything. The materialist position is intellectually powerful but philosophically incomplete. It may be the best explanation we have, but whether it is the true explanation remains deeply contested. Part 5. The mind-body problem. The interaction problem we encountered with Cartesian dualism is actually a specific instance of a larger philosophical puzzle called the mind-body problem. This problem asks, what is the relationship between mental and physical phenomena, and how can they affect each other? The mind-body problem is not just historical or abstract, it has immediate practical consequences. When you decide to raise your arm and your arm rises, what exactly has happened? Did an immaterial mental event cause a physical event? If so, does this violate the physical principle that the physical world is causally closed, that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause? If not, was your decision to raise your arm actually causally ineffective, with the real cause being some prior brain state? This problem becomes even more pressing when we consider the conservation of energy. Physics tells us that energy is conserved in closed physical systems. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. But if an immaterial mind causes physical events, it seems to be injecting new energy into the physical system from nowhere. When your decision moves your arm, work is being done, energy is being expended. Where does this energy come from if the mind is immaterial? Descartes was aware of this problem, but lived before the law of conservation of energy was formulated. By the 19th century, as physics became more rigorous, the energy problem became fatal for interactionist dualism. If mental causation adds energy to physical systems, the law of conservation is violated. If mental causation does not add energy, then it is hard to see how it could actually cause anything physical. This is called the causal closure argument. The physical world is causally closed. Every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, therefore mental events either do not exist or are themselves physical. Let us examine the major proposed solutions to the mind-body problem. We have already discussed substance dualism, which simply accepts that mind and body are different substances that somehow interact. We have seen why this faces severe difficulties. Epiphenomenalism is the view that mental events are caused by physical events but do not cause anything themselves. Consciousness is like the whistle on a steam train, produced by the engine but playing no role in making the train move. Your brain states cause both your behavior and your conscious experiences. The experiences seem to cause your behavior, but this is an illusion. The real cause is always the underlying brain activity. This view solves the interaction problem by denying mental to physical causation altogether. Only physical events cause other physical events. Mental events are side effects, causally inert byproducts of brain processes. This preserves the causal closure of physics, but at a serious cost. It makes consciousness completely irrelevant. Your conscious decision to raise your arm does not actually cause your arm to rise. The brain state that causes your arm to rise also causes the conscious experience of deciding, but the experience itself does nothing. Most philosophers find epiphenomenalism deeply counterintuitive. It violates our most basic sense that our conscious thoughts and decisions matter, that they affect what we do. If consciousness is causally impotent, why did it evolve? Evolution by natural selection can only favor traits that affect survival and reproduction, which requires causal efficacy. If consciousness does nothing, natural selection cannot explain its existence. It would be an inexplicable miracle that such a complex phenomenon evolved without providing any adaptive advantage. Parallelism, mentioned earlier, denies interaction in both directions. Mental and physical events run in parallel like two synchronized clocks, never causally affecting each other. This avoids the interaction problem entirely, but seems to make mind and body mysteriously coordinated. Idealism takes a radically different approach by denying the existence of physical substance altogether. Bishop George Berkeley argued that everything is mental. Physical objects are collections of ideas or sensations in minds. The table in front of you is not a material thing, but a stable pattern of sensory experiences. God's mind perceives everything, which is why things continue to exist when no human is observing them. Idealism solves the mind-body problem by eliminating one side of it. If everything is mental, there is no physical substance to interact with mind. The problem disappears. However, idealism seems wildly counterintuitive to most people. It is hard to believe that mountains, stars, and atoms are ideas rather than material things existing independently of minds. Neutral monism, proposed by philosophers like Bertrand Russell and William James, suggests that both mind and matter are constructed from a more fundamental neutral substance. Mental and physical properties are different arrangements or aspects of this underlying stuff. Neither mind nor matter is fundamental. This view is elegant but vague. What exactly is this neutral substance? How does it give rise to both mental and physical properties? Without answers, neutral monism is more a promissory note than a solution. Emergentism argues that mental properties emerge from physical properties when matter reaches sufficient complexity. Just as liquidity emerges from H2O molecules arranged in a certain way, consciousness emerges from neurons organized in brains. The mental is not reducible to the physical, but depends on and emerges from it. This is a form of property dualism we mentioned earlier. Emergence can be weak or strong. Weak emergence means that mental properties are in principle deducible from physical properties plus laws of nature, even if this deduction is too complex for us to perform. Water's liquidity is weakly emergent. It follows necessarily from facts about H2O molecules and physics, though the derivation is complicated. Strong emergence means that mental properties are genuinely novel, not deducible even in principle from underlying physical facts. The whole is more than the sum of its parts in a metaphysically robust sense. If consciousness is weakly emergent, it is unclear how this differs from reductive materialism. If mental properties ultimately follow from physical properties and physical laws, then in what sense are they non-physical? But if consciousness is strongly emergent, we face the problem of downward causation. How can an emergent property affect the physical processes from which it emerged without violating causal closure? If your conscious decision is genuinely something new and non-physical that emerges from your brain, how does it then reach back down to affect the physical neurons? Panpsychism offers a radical alternative. Consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself. Electrons, atoms, and molecules all have primitive forms of experience. Complex consciousness like ours emerges when these micro-experiences combine in sophisticated ways. This view is ancient, found in various forms in Leibniz, Spinoza, and Eastern philosophy. It is experiencing a revival among contemporary philosophers frustrated with materialism's inability to explain consciousness. Panpsychism's appeal is that it avoids having consciousness suddenly appear from non-conscious matter. If matter was never wholly non-conscious, we do not need to explain how consciousness emerges from its absence. The combination problem remains, though. How do micro-experiences of particles combine into the unified experience of a human consciousness? This is called the combination problem, and it may be just as difficult as explaining how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter. How do billions of tiny experiential points become one unified field of awareness? Each proposed solution to the mind-body problem has costs and benefits. Dualism respects our intuitions about consciousness being different from matter, but faces the interaction problem. Materialism respects scientific methodology, but struggles to explain subjective experience. Idealism avoids the problem by denying physical substance, but contradicts common sense. Epiphenomenalism preserves causal closure, but makes consciousness causally irrelevant. Emergentism tries to have it both ways, but faces the downward causation problem. Panpsychism distributes consciousness throughout nature, but faces the combination problem. No solution is obviously correct, and the debate continues. Perhaps the most important insight is that the mind-body problem reveals deep gaps in our understanding. We do not yet know what physical matter fundamentally is at the deepest level. We do not fully understand what consciousness is. We are trying to understand the relationship between two things we do not yet fully grasp. This does not mean the problem is unsolvable, but it suggests humility is appropriate. The solution may require conceptual frameworks we have not yet developed. Part 6. Personal Identity over Time. One of the soul's traditional functions is explaining personal identity. What makes you the same person over time despite constant change? This question matters profoundly for practical ethics and law. Is the criminal who committed a crime 10 years ago the same person now being punished? Should you be held responsible for promises you made in the past? Does the person with late-stage dementia who no longer recognizes anyone remain the same individual who signed the advance directive? Let us begin with the puzzle that motivates theories of personal identity. The cells in your body are mostly replaced over years. Your thoughts, memories, beliefs and personality change throughout life. The you of today differs from the you of 20 years ago in nearly every physical and psychological respect. Yet we ordinarily assume you are the same person. What grounds this identity? The soul offers an apparently simple answer. You are the same person because you have the same soul. Your soul is the unchanging substrate that persists through all physical and mental changes. It is like a thread connecting all the different temporal stages of your life into one continuous person. This is the simple view of personal identity, and it has immediate appeal. It explains our strong intuition that we persist through time. It provides a clear criterion for deciding identity questions. But the soul theory faces serious problems. First, it is empty unless we have independent criteria for soul identity. How do we know whether the person in front of us now has the same soul they had yesterday? We cannot observe souls directly. All we have access to is physical appearance, memories, personality and behavior. If we use these to infer soul identity, then the soul is not doing the explanatory work these observable features are. Second, the soul theory seems to allow logically possible but practically useless scenarios. Imagine two people swap souls while sleeping. They wake up with switched bodies, but all the same memories and personalities. The soul theory says the souls switched, so personal identity switched. But how could we ever know this happened? And does it even make sense to say it happened if nothing observable changed? Third, the soul theory makes personal identity too metaphysically deep. It suggests that what makes you you is some hidden spiritual essence that even you cannot access. But surely you have special authority over your own identity. You know you are you better than anyone else knows it. If identity depends on an inaccessible soul, this privileged self-knowledge seems threatened. These problems motivated John Locke to propose a revolutionary alternative in the 17th century, psychological continuity theory. Locke argued that personal identity consists in continuity of consciousness, especially memory. You are the same person who did something in the past, if you remember doing it from the inside. Identity follows psychological connections, not sameness of soul or body. This is why, in Locke's prince and cobbler thought experiment, the person with the prince's memories in the cobbler's body is the prince, not the cobbler. Locke's theory has powerful intuitive support. Memory seems crucial to identity in a way that soul or body does not. If you woke up with completely different memories, believing yourself to be someone else, living a different life, it seems you would be that other person. Conversely, if your brain were transplanted into a new body, most people think you would go where your brain goes, because your memories and personality would go there. This suggests psychological continuity, not physical or spiritual substance, grounds identity. However, Locke's theory faces immediate objections. Thomas Reid pointed out the problem of transitivity. Suppose a young boy is punished for stealing apples. Later, as a brave soldier, he remembers stealing the apples. Still later, as a general, he remembers his brave action as a soldier, but has forgotten stealing the apples. According to Locke, the general is identical to the soldier because he remembers being him. The soldier is identical to the boy because he remembers being him. By transitivity, the general should be identical to the boy, but the general does not remember being the boy, so by Locke's criterion, they are not identical. This violates the logical requirement that identity is transitive. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. The memory theory also faces the problem of circularity. What makes a memory yours? Philosopher Joseph Butler argued that remembering an experience presupposes you are the same person who had that experience. You cannot use memory to define personal identity because memory already assumes personal identity. When you remember doing something, you remember you doing it. The sense of "I did that" is built into memory, not derived from it. Modern philosophers refined psychological continuity theory to address these problems. Derek Parfit and others argued that identity is what matters, not what grounds identity. What we care about is psychological continuity and connectedness, overlapping chains of memory, personality, and psychological features linking past to present to future. You now are psychologically connected to you yesterday by many direct memories, beliefs, and traits. You now are psychologically continuous with you as a child through overlapping chains of connection, even though you may not directly remember many childhood experiences. Parfit went further, arguing that personal identity is not what matters for survival and morality. What matters is psychological continuity, whether or not it constitutes strict identity. In thought experiments involving teleportation, fission, or uploading consciousness to computers, strict identity might fail, but psychological continuity could persist. If a Star Trek transporter destroys your body and recreates an exact copy on another planet with all your memories and personality, have you survived? Most people's intuitions are divided. Parfit argued this shows identity is not the deep metaphysical relation we thought. What matters for rational self-interest and moral responsibility is continuity, not identity. This has radical implications. If psychological continuity rather than strict identity is what matters, then survival could admit of degrees. You could be related to your future self more or less strongly, depending on the degree of psychological connection. This might explain why we care less about our distant future self than our near future self. It is not because our distant self is less real, but because the psychological connections are weaker. The bodily continuity theory offers a different approach. You are the same person because you have the same living body, particularly the same brain. This theory respects the biological continuity underlying personal identity. It explains why you care about future pain and pleasure. The body that will experience them is your body, and it is scientifically respectable, avoiding metaphysically dubious souls or problematically circular psychological criteria. But bodily continuity theory faces counterexamples. If your brain were gradually replaced with functionally identical artificial neurons, one at a time, most people think you would survive throughout the process, even though your body became increasingly artificial. This suggests what matters is not biological substance, but functional organization. The body matters not in itself, but as the vehicle for psychological continuity. The closest continua theory, developed by Robert Nozick, offers a pragmatic approach. You are identical to whichever past or future person is your closest continua in terms of psychological and physical similarity. If there is a clear closest continua, that is you. If there are multiple equally close continuas, as in fission cases where your brain is split and each hemisphere implanted in a new body, then identity fails. You do not survive as either resulting person because neither is uniquely you. This theory handles many puzzle cases elegantly, but at a cost. It makes identity depend on external facts about whether competitors exist. If you undergo fission, but one resulting person immediately dies, you are identical to the survivor. If both survive, you are identical to neither. Whether you survive depends not on intrinsic facts about you, but on external facts about whether someone else exists. This seems to make identity too extrinsic, too dependent on external circumstances. These debates have practical implications. Consider advanced directives for medical care. You write instructions now about treatment you want if you develop dementia and cannot decide for yourself. But if severe dementia destroys enough psychological continuity, is the person in the hospital bed really you? Should your past instructions bind someone who no longer shares your memories, values, or personality? Some philosophers argue that severe dementia patients are not identical to their past selves, and therefore past directives have limited authority. Others argue that bodily continuity or weaker psychological connection is sufficient for identity and moral authority. The persistence question also matters for punishment. Is it just to punish someone for crimes committed decades ago after they have completely reformed? If psychological continuity is weak enough, are we punishing a different person? If bodily continuity grounds identity, then yes, the person who committed the crime still exists and can be justly punished. But if psychological continuity matters more, extensive reform might undermine the justice of punishment. The soul seemed to offer a simple answer to personal identity, but on examination the question is far more complex. We are left with competing theories, each capturing some intuitions while violating others. Perhaps there is no single correct answer, because personal identity is not a deep metaphysical fact, but a practical construct. We might draw identity boundaries different ways for different purposes: legal responsibility, moral concern, prudential planning. Or perhaps future neuroscience and philosophy will reveal a clear criterion we have not yet discovered. The question remains open. Part 7. Consciousness and the hard problem. Consciousness is the most puzzling feature of mind and the strongest remaining motivation for believing in something beyond the physical. When you taste coffee, see blue sky, or feel pain, you have a subjective first-person experience. There is something it is like to be you, to have your experiences. This simple fact poses philosophy's deepest challenge to materialism. The philosopher Thomas Nagel crystallized this problem in his famous paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" Bats navigate by echolocation, emitting high-frequency sounds and sensing the echoes. We can study the physics of sound, the neuroscience of bat brains, and the behavior of bats in exhaustive detail. But no amount of this objective third-person information tells us what it is like from the inside to experience the world through echolocation. The subjective character of experience, what Nagel called the subjective point of view, cannot be captured by objective physical description. This insight applies to human consciousness too. You could have complete physical information about someone's brain when they see red, which neurons fire, which neurotransmitters are released, which brain regions activate. But would this tell you what red looks like to them? The redness of red, the felt quality of the experience, seems to be something over and above the physical facts. This felt quality is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic subjective qualities of conscious experiences. David Chalmers distinguished between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, though still scientifically challenging, concern explaining the cognitive functions and behaviors associated with consciousness: attention, perception, learning, memory, verbal report. We can at least conceive of how these might be explained in terms of neural mechanisms. They are problems for psychology and neuroscience, difficult but not philosophically mysterious. The hard problem is explaining why there is subjective experience at all. Why does information processing in the brain produce an inner mental life? Why is there something it is like to be a human or an animal, rather than information processing happening in the dark with no accompanying experience? You could imagine a being physically and functionally identical to you, processing information just like you do, but with no inner experience. Philosophers call such beings philosophical zombies. They behave exactly like conscious beings, but have no subjective experience. The conceivability of zombies suggests consciousness is not logically entailed by physical facts. Even complete physical information about a system does not logically imply the existence of subjective experience. You need an additional fact, that certain physical processes are accompanied by experience. This is called the explanatory gap. There is a gap between physical descriptions and experiential reality that physical theory seems unable to bridge. Frank Jackson illustrated this with his famous knowledge argument about Mary the colour scientist. Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room, learning everything there is to know about colour vision through black and white books and monitors. She knows all the physics of light, all the neuroscience of colour perception, every objective fact about what happens when people see colours. Then one day, Mary leaves the room and sees red for the first time. Does she learn something new? Intuitively, yes. She learns what red looks like, what it is like to experience red. But if she already knew all the physical facts, and she learns something new, then there must be non-physical facts about consciousness. This suggests materialism is false. Materialists have responded to these arguments in various ways. Some deny that zombies are genuinely conceivable, arguing that our intuitions about what is possible are unreliable. Others grant that zombies are conceivable but deny that conceivability implies possibility. Just because we can imagine something does not mean it is metaphysically possible. Perhaps consciousness is necessarily connected to certain physical structures, even if we cannot see this necessity from our limited perspective. Regarding Mary, some materialists argue that she does not learn new facts, but acquires new abilities. Seeing red gives her the ability to recognize, imagine, and remember red. But this is knowing how, not knowing that. She gains new capacities without learning new facts. Others argue that she does learn a new fact, what her own experience of red is like. But this is still a physical fact about her own brain states, just one she could not know without having the experience. These responses are philosophically sophisticated, but may not fully dissolve the problem. The phenomenology, the felt character of experience, seems stubbornly resistant to physical explanation. When you experience pain, there is the neural activity, which is publicly observable and measurable, and there is the hurting, the awful feeling, which only you can experience directly. No description of C fibers firing or nociceptor activation captures that awful quality. This is the core of the hard problem. Some philosophers embrace Mysterianism, the view that the hard problem may be permanently unsolvable for humans. Colin McGinn argued that our cognitive architecture might be fundamentally unsuited to understanding how brains produce consciousness, just as dogs cannot understand quantum mechanics. We can know that consciousness arises from brains, but the mechanism might be cognitively closed to us. This is not a comforting conclusion, but it might be realistic. Others pursue new frameworks that might bridge the gap. Integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree it integrates information in a unified way. This theory makes testable predictions and provides a mathematical measure of consciousness. However, critics argue it does not really explain why integrated information should be accompanied by subjective experience. It changes the subject from explaining experience to measuring information integration. Global workspace theory, developed by Bernard Baars and others, proposes that consciousness arises when information is broadcast globally throughout the brain, becoming available to multiple cognitive systems. This explains the function of consciousness, making information widely available for reasoning, planning, and verbal report. But again, it does not clearly explain why this global availability should feel like anything. It addresses the easy problems, but may not touch the hard problem. Higher-order thought theories suggest that consciousness arises when you have thoughts about your mental states. You are consciously seeing red when you have a higher-order thought that you are seeing red. This attempts to explain the reflexive, self-aware character of consciousness. But critics object that this makes consciousness too intellectual. Animals and infants seem conscious without sophisticated higher-order thoughts, and it still does not explain why higher-order thoughts should produce subjective experience. Perhaps the most radical response is to deny that there is a hard problem at all. Daniel Dennett argues that qualia as traditionally conceived do not exist. What we call subjective experience is just various cognitive and reactive dispositions. The sense that there is something mysterious, some ineffable what-it-is-likeness, is an illusion created by the limitations of introspection. When we carefully examine what we mean by consciousness, we find only functional capacities and behavioral dispositions, nothing metaphysically mysterious. This eliminativist approach is intellectually austere but difficult to accept. It seems to deny the most obvious fact about your mental life, that you are experiencing right now. The redness you see, the sounds you hear, the thoughts you think seem undeniably real. To be told these are illusions feels like being told you do not exist. Perhaps Dennett is right that our concepts of qualia are confused, but something seems to remain that needs explaining. The hard problem matters beyond academic philosophy. It determines whether artificial intelligence could ever be truly conscious or just simulate consciousness. It affects how we think about animal consciousness and therefore animal ethics. It shapes our understanding of disorders of consciousness like vegetative states and minimally conscious states. And it touches the deep question of whether science can explain everything or whether some aspects of reality resist scientific explanation. The persistence of the hard problem after decades of debate suggests it might be a genuine limit of our current understanding. We may need new concepts, new theoretical frameworks, or new empirical discoveries to make progress. Or we may need to accept that subjective experience is a fundamental feature of reality, not reducible to anything more basic. The soul concept attempted to capture this irreducibility by positing an immaterial substance. Modern philosophy of mind searches for better concepts, but the mystery consciousness poses remains largely unsolved. Part 8. Neuroscience and Empirical Challenges. The strongest contemporary challenge to the concept of the soul comes not from philosophical argument, but from empirical neuroscience. Hundreds of years of brain research have revealed that every aspect of mental life depends intimately on specific physical brain structures and processes. This evidence does not conclusively disprove the soul, but it makes the hypothesis seem increasingly unnecessary and implausible. Let us begin with the most dramatic cases. Brain damage. Phineas Gage, whom we mentioned earlier, was a railroad construction foreman in 1848. An explosion drove an iron rod through his left frontal lobe. Remarkably, he survived and could walk and talk immediately after the accident. But his personality changed completely. Before the injury, he was responsible, hard-working, and well-liked. After the injury, he became impulsive, profane, unable to plan or follow through on decisions. His physician wrote that Gage was no longer Gage, suggesting the injury had created a different person. If the soul is the seat of personality and moral character, why would damaging the frontal lobe change these qualities? The dualist might respond that the brain is the instrument through which the soul operates, and damaging the instrument impairs function. But this analogy fails on close inspection. When a piano is damaged, the music becomes distorted, but the pianist's skill and musical knowledge remain intact. The pianist could demonstrate their knowledge on another piano, but Gage could not demonstrate his former personality and judgment through any other means. His character itself had changed, not just his ability to express an unchanged character. This suggests personality is a property of the brain, not of an independent soul using the brain. Modern neurosurgery provides countless similar cases. Patients with frontal lobe tumours often show changes in moral judgment, becoming unable to feel guilt or empathy. Damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex leaves people able to reason abstractly about ethics, but unable to make appropriate moral judgments in real situations. They become sociopathic not through choice, but through brain damage. If the soul is the source of moral agency, this should not happen. Temporal lobe epilepsy illustrates another striking connection between brain and mind. Seizures in the temporal lobes can produce intense religious experiences, feelings of divine presence, cosmic unity, or spiritual transcendence. Some of history's most influential religious figures, including possibly St. Paul and Joan of Arc, may have had temporal lobe epilepsy. Does this mean their religious experiences were false, merely epileptic hallucinations? Not necessarily, but it does show that experiences people interpret as encounters with the divine can be produced by abnormal brain activity. If the soul connects us to spiritual realities, why would temporal lobe seizures reliably produce spiritual experiences? The simpler explanation is that what we call spiritual experience is a particular pattern of brain activity. The split brain studies we mentioned earlier deserve deeper examination. Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga studied patients who had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy. This eliminates communication between the left and right brain hemispheres. The results revealed something shocking. The two hemispheres seem to have separate consciousnesses. Each hemisphere can perceive, learn, and respond independently, often without the other hemisphere knowing. In one famous experiment, the word key was flashed to only the left hemisphere, which controls speech. The patient could easily say what they saw. But when ring was flashed to only the right hemisphere, which does not control speech, the patient said they saw nothing. However, when asked to use their left hand, which the right hemisphere controls, to select an object from behind a screen, they selected a ring. The right hemisphere saw the ring and directed the left hand, but the speaking left hemisphere did not know what the right hemisphere had seen. Even more disturbing are cases where the two hemispheres have different preferences or beliefs. One patient's left hand would try to button his shirt while his right hand tried to unbutton it. Another patient's right hemisphere wanted a different career than the left hemisphere. When asked what job he wanted, the speaking left hemisphere said draftsman, but the left hand spelled out race car driver. Are there two people in one skull? Do split-brain patients have two souls? The soul theory struggles with this. If the soul is simple and indivisible, as classical philosophy maintained, it cannot be split by cutting nerve fibers. Yet the evidence strongly suggests that unity of consciousness depends on physical connections between brain regions. When those connections are severed, consciousness itself fragments. This suggests consciousness is not produced by an indivisible soul, but is an integrated pattern of brain activity. Neuroscientists can now map which brain regions are responsible for which mental functions with remarkable precision. The fusiform face area is specialized for recognizing faces. Damage here causes prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces by sight. Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is essential for speech production. Damage causes Broca's aphasia, where patients understand language but cannot speak fluently. Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe is essential for language comprehension. Damage causes Wernicke's aphasia, where patients speak fluently but make no sense and cannot understand others. The hippocampus is crucial for forming new long-term memories. Damage causes anterograde amnesia, the inability to form new memories while old memories remain intact. Patient H.M., studied extensively by Brenda Milner, had his hippocampus removed to treat epilepsy. After surgery, he could no longer form new long-term memories. He lived in a permanent present, forgetting events moments after they occurred. He could learn new motor skills, showing that procedural memory uses different brain systems than declarative memory. But he never remembered learning these skills and would deny possessing them while demonstrating them perfectly. If the soul stores memories, why would removing the hippocampus selectively impair forming new memories while leaving old memories and motor learning intact? The evidence suggests different types of memory are physically stored in different brain structures. The amygdala's role in emotion provides another clear example of mind-brain dependence. This almond-shaped structure is crucial for processing fear and threat. Patients with bilateral amygdala damage show remarkably reduced fear responses. Patient SM with complete bilateral amygdala damage approached dangerous situations fearlessly, showing no normal anxiety about snakes, spiders, or threatening people. She could intellectually understand that situations were dangerous, but did not feel afraid. If the soul is the seat of emotion, why would amygdala damage eliminate fear while leaving other emotions and intellectual understanding intact? The evidence suggests emotions are specific brain processes, not emanations from an immaterial soul. Psychopharmacology provides perhaps the most direct evidence of mind-brain identity. Drugs that alter brain chemistry predictably alter consciousness, mood, cognition, and personality. General anesthetics like propofol can completely shut down consciousness within seconds by enhancing the neurotransmitter GABA. When you wake from anesthesia, there is no memory of the intervening time, no sense of time passing. Consciousness simply stops and restarts. If consciousness depends on an immaterial soul, why would altering GABA receptors eliminate it? Antidepressants like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors change mood by increasing serotonin availability in synapses. This can transform a person from suicidal depression to normalcy. It can change not just feelings, but entire worldviews and personalities. If the soul determines who you are, chemical changes to neurotransmitter systems should not alter personality so profoundly. But they do, suggesting personality is a pattern of brain chemistry and neural connections. Psychedelic drugs provide even more dramatic evidence. Psilocybin, LSD, and DMT profoundly alter consciousness by affecting serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor. They can produce experiences of ego dissolution, unity with the universe, encounters with seemingly autonomous entities, and mystical states indistinguishable from spontaneous religious experiences. Many people report these experiences as the most meaningful of their lives. If spiritual experiences represent the soul connecting to transcendent realities, why can they be reliably produced by molecules affecting specific brain receptors? The simpler explanation is that what we call spiritual experience is a particular brain state, not contact with immaterial realms. Stimulants like cocaine and amphetamines increase dopamine, producing euphoria, energy, and confidence. Dopamine antagonists used to treat schizophrenia can make life feel meaningless and joyless. The sensation that life has meaning or purpose, something that seems deeply spiritual, can be manipulated by changing dopamine levels. This suggests that even our sense of meaning and transcendence is neurochemical. The soul seems to leave no remainder, nothing that cannot be affected by altering the brain. Transcranial magnetic stimulation allows neuroscientists to temporarily disrupt specific brain regions. disrupting the right temporoparietal junction can reduce people's ability to judge intentions in moral dilemmas, making them focus more on outcomes than intentions. Disrupting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can temporarily impair working memory and attention. We can turn aspects of cognition on and off with magnetic fields, like tuning a radio. This strongly suggests mental capacities are functions of brain activity, not of an immaterial soul. Brain stimulation can also enhance mental capacities. Transcranial direct current stimulation can temporarily improve mathematical ability, language learning, and attention. Deep brain stimulation, using electrodes implanted in the brain, can relieve depression that resists all other treatments. It can also restore movement in Parkinson's disease by stimulating the subthalamic nucleus. If mental capacities and emotional states were properties of an immaterial soul, physical stimulation of brain tissue should not affect them. The progressive nature of dementia poses another challenge to the soul concept. In Alzheimer's disease, plaques and tangles gradually destroy neurons, particularly in memory and reasoning areas. Personality slowly dissolves as the disease progresses. Patients lose memories, then language, then recognition of loved ones, eventually losing all distinctively human capacities. At what point does the soul leave? Or does the soul degrade along with the brain? If the soul degrades, it must be somehow dependent on or constituted by brain activity. If the soul remains intact while the person loses all mental capacities, then the soul is not the seat of personality and cognition, and it is unclear what the soul is. Developmental neuroscience shows that mental capacities emerge gradually as the brain develops. Newborn infants lack most cognitive abilities, self-awareness, and complex emotions. These develop over years as neural connections form and refine. Myelination of frontal lobe pathways continues into the mid-20s, which explains why adolescents show less impulse control and long-term planning than adults. If the soul is present from conception and is the source of mental capacities, why do these capacities depend on brain maturation? The evidence suggests mental capacities are brain capacities, developing as the brain develops. Twin studies reveal genetic influences on personality, intelligence, and even religiosity. Identical twins raised apart are more similar than fraternal twins raised together. This shows genes significantly influence mental traits. But genes code for brain structure and chemistry, not for immaterial souls. If personality comes from the soul, genetic influences should not affect it. None of this evidence conclusively disproves the soul. A sophisticated dualist could argue that the soul requires a functioning brain to operate in the physical world, just as a driver requires a functioning car. Brain damage impairs the soul's ability to manifest, not the soul itself. But this response becomes increasingly strained as we identify specific brain mechanisms for every aspect of mind. If the soul leaves no detectable causal trace, if everything about mental life can be explained by brain activity, then positing a soul violates Occam's razor. It is an unnecessary hypothesis. The neuroscience evidence does not prove materialism is true. It does not solve the hard problem of consciousness or explain why subjective experience exists at all. But it does show that the soul, as traditionally conceived, an immaterial substance that thinks, feels, remembers, and makes decisions, is not supported by evidence. Mental phenomena correlate with and depend on specific brain states in exactly the way we would expect if mind is what brain does, not the way we would expect if mind is an independent soul using the brain as an instrument. The soul hypothesis has become scientifically unproductive, unable to explain or predict anything that neuroscience cannot explain better. Part 9. Eastern Philosophical Perspectives. Western philosophy has dominated our discussion so far, but Eastern traditions offer radically different perspectives on the soul and self. These views are not merely exotic alternatives, but serious philosophical positions that challenge Western assumptions and offer new ways to think about consciousness and identity. Buddhist philosophy famously denies the existence of a permanent self or soul. This doctrine, called anatman or anatta, meaning no self, is central to all Buddhist traditions. The Buddha taught that belief in a permanent self is the root cause of suffering. We crave permanence, but everything changes. We identify with body, feelings, thoughts, or consciousness, trying to find something stable to call self. But on examination, nothing fits this description. The Buddha gave a systematic argument for no self. He analyzed experience into 5 aggregates or skandhas: form, which is the physical body; feeling, which is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations; perception, which recognizes and categorizes experiences; mental formations, which include thoughts, emotions, and volitions; and consciousness, which is awareness of objects. The Buddha asked, is any of these aggregates the self? Is the body the self? No, because the body changes and we can imagine existing without this particular body. Are feelings the self? No, because feelings constantly change and are not under our control. If feelings were the self, we could make ourselves always feel pleasant. The same reasoning applies to perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Each aggregate is impermanent, changing, and not fully under our control. Therefore, none can be the self. Moreover, the Buddha argued, the 5 aggregates are interdependent. Consciousness depends on sense organs and objects. Feelings depend on consciousness. Mental formations depend on feelings and perceptions. There is no separate entity that has or owns these aggregates. There is just the aggregates themselves, arising and passing in dependence on causes and conditions. This is the doctrine of dependent origination. Everything arises in dependence on conditions and ceases when conditions change. There is no independent permanent entity anywhere in experience. What we call the self is just a conventional label for a causally connected stream of mental and physical events. It is like a river. We say the Ganges, as if it is one permanent thing, but actually it is constantly changing water flowing in a pattern. There is no river essence beyond the flowing water. Similarly, there is no self-essence beyond the flowing stream of experience. But if there is no self, who experiences suffering? Who acts and accumulates karma? Who becomes enlightened? The Buddhist answer is subtle. There is experiencing without an experiencer, acting without an actor, knowing without a knower. These processes occur, but there is no separate subject that owns them. It is like when we say it rains. There is no separate it that does the raining. Raining simply occurs. Similarly, thinking occurs, but there is no thinker separate from thoughts. Experience occurs, but there is no experiencer separate from experiences. This is philosophically radical. Western philosophy from Descartes onward has assumed that consciousness requires a subject, an I, that is conscious. Buddhist philosophy denies this. There is awareness without anyone who is aware. The sense of self, the feeling of being a unified subject, is itself just another mental event, not evidence of a real substantial self. The Buddha illustrated this with the chariot analogy. A chariot has wheels, axle, chassis, and other parts. Is the chariot identical to any of these parts? No. Is it something separate from all the parts? No, because when you remove all the parts, no chariot remains. The chariot is just a conventional designation for the collection of parts in functional relation. Similarly, the self is a conventional designation for the 5 aggregates in causal relation. It exists conventionally, but not ultimately. This does not mean you do not exist at all. It means you exist in the way a chariot exists, as a useful conventional designation rather than as an ultimate metaphysical entity. In daily life, we can meaningfully talk about persons, make plans, hold people responsible. But at the ultimate level of analysis, there is no separate self persisting through time, only causally connected moments of experience. This is called the two truths doctrine, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Later, Buddhist philosophers developed sophisticated arguments against the self. Nagarjuna, the great Mahayana philosopher, used reductio arguments to show that a self is logically impossible. If the self is identical to the aggregates, then there are 5 selves, and the self would be impermanent like the aggregates. If the self is different from the aggregates, we should be able to identify it separately, but we cannot. If the self possesses the aggregates, this requires a relationship between self and aggregates, but relationships require relata, and we have not established that the self exists. Therefore, the self neither is nor is not the aggregates, neither possesses nor does not possess them. The concept is incoherent, a conceptual fiction useful for practical purposes, but ultimately empty. The no-self doctrine has profound practical implications. If there is no self, then self-centered craving is based on a mistake. We cling to what we think of as me and mine, but this is clinging to a fiction. Seeing through this fiction liberates us from suffering. This is not a metaphysical belief, but a transformative realization achieved through meditation and insight. Hindu philosophy offers a contrasting view, though one that also challenges Western substance dualism. The Upanishads, ancient Hindu texts, teach that the true self, called Atman, is identical to Brahman, the ultimate reality underlying all existence. This is expressed in the famous phrase, Tat Tvam Asi, meaning that thou art. Your deepest self is not your body, thoughts, or personality, but the eternal, unchanging consciousness that witnesses all experience. Shankara, the great Advaita Vedanta philosopher, developed this non-dualist view systematically. He distinguished the true self, Atman, from the empirical self we identify with in daily life. The empirical self, including body, mind, and personality, is part of Maya, the illusory appearance of multiplicity and change. The true self is pure consciousness, existence, and bliss. It is not an object of experience, but the subject that experiences all objects. You cannot know Atman the way you know objects, because Atman is the knower, never the known. This sounds mysterious, but Shankara argued for it rigorously. In deep, dreamless sleep, there are no thoughts, sensations, or perceptions. Yet when you wake, you say, "I slept peacefully," or "I knew nothing." This shows that some awareness persists through deep sleep, witnessing even the absence of ordinary consciousness. This witnessing awareness is Atman, distinct from the changing contents of consciousness. Moreover, Shankara argued, the self cannot be an object because the self is what knows all objects. Everything you know appears to your consciousness. Your body, thoughts and feelings are all known by you, therefore none of them can be you. You are the consciousness that knows them, the unchanging awareness in which all experience appears and disappears. This consciousness is eternal because it has no parts that could separate and no causes that could cease. But unlike Buddhist no-self, Shankara's view posits a real substantial self, indeed the only real substance. Multiplicity and change are illusory appearances. Ultimately, there is only one consciousness, Brahman, appearing as many individual consciousnesses through ignorance. When you realize your true nature, you see that you were never separate from Brahman. The apparent individual soul, jiva, merges back into or recognizes its identity with universal consciousness. These Eastern views challenge Western assumptions in different ways. Buddhism denies that consciousness requires a substantial subject. It sees the self as a process rather than an entity, a verb rather than a noun. Advaita Vedanta affirms a self, but one radically different from the Western soul, not personal or individual, but universal and impersonal. Neither view fits neatly into Western categories of substance, dualism, or materialism. Can these Eastern views be reconciled with modern neuroscience? On one reading, Buddhist no-self aligns well with neuroscience. There is no unified self-center in the brain, just distributed processes that create an illusory sense of unified selfhood. The brain constructs a narrative self from fragmentary experiences, creating the illusion of continuity and unity. This neuroscientific picture resonates with Buddhist analysis of the self as a conventional construct. However, Buddhism also posits rebirth, consciousness continuing after death and entering a new body. This sits uneasily with materialism. If consciousness is just brain activity, how could it continue without a brain? Some modern Buddhist thinkers interpret rebirth metaphorically or focus on the no-self doctrine while remaining agnostic about literal rebirth. Others maintain that consciousness is more fundamental than matter and can exist independently, though not as a permanent soul. The Yogacara school of Buddhism developed a consciousness-only philosophy resembling idealism. All experience is mental. What we call external objects are just mental constructions. This school posits an alaya vijnana, a storehouse consciousness that carries karmic seeds across lifetimes. This seems to contradict the no-self doctrine by positing something continuous. But Yogacara philosophers argued the storehouse consciousness is itself ultimately empty of self-nature, just a deeper level of process. Advaita Vedanta's universal consciousness is harder to reconcile with neuroscience. If consciousness is identical in everyone and everything, just appearing different due to different limiting conditions, this suggests a kind of panpsychism or cosmic idealism. Some quantum physicists have proposed that consciousness might be fundamental to reality, with individual consciousnesses being localized instances of a universal field. But this remains speculative and scientifically unproven. What Eastern philosophy offers. Western philosophy is not necessarily correct answers, but different questions and frameworks. Western philosophy asks, what is the self? Is it material or immaterial? Eastern philosophy asks, is there a self at all? Who is asking the question? It emphasizes first-person investigation through meditation rather than third-person observation and logical argument. Many contemporary philosophers and neuroscientists find the Buddhist no-self view compelling. Thomas Metzinger argues that the phenomenal self is a representational construct, a self-model created by the brain. There is no thinker behind thoughts, just an ongoing process of thinking that creates the illusion of a thinker. Sam Harris, both a neuroscientist and meditation practitioner, argues that the sense of being a separate self located behind the eyes looking out is an illusion that can be seen through with sustained introspection. What we call the self is actually a sequence of conscious moments, each arising and passing without a persisting subject. Others find the Advaita view of pure consciousness appealing. They argue that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is fundamental to reality, with the brain serving to localize or filter universal consciousness into individual perspectives. This avoids the hard problem by making consciousness primary rather than trying to derive it from matter. However, it faces its own problems. How does universal consciousness become divided into apparently separate individual minds? Why does brain damage affect consciousness if consciousness is fundamental? Eastern and Western philosophies of self represent different cognitive and cultural traditions grappling with the same deep mystery. Neither has definitively solved the problem, but each illuminates aspects the other might miss. Western substance dualism takes seriously the unity and persistence of personal identity. Buddhist no-self takes seriously the impermanence and lack of any unchanging essence in experience. Advaita Vedanta takes seriously the possibility that consciousness itself is the fundamental reality. Materialism takes seriously the scientific evidence of mind-brain dependence. A complete account might need to integrate insights from all these traditions, though whether such integration is possible remains an open question. Part 10. Contemporary debates and new frameworks. Contemporary philosophy of mind has moved beyond the classical soul versus materialism debate to explore more sophisticated frameworks. These new approaches attempt to preserve what seems right about both positions while avoiding their problems. Understanding these contemporary debates is essential for grasping where the soul question stands today. Functionalism, which we mentioned earlier, has become the dominant view in analytic philosophy of mind. Proposed by Hilary Putnam, Jerry Fodor and others, functionalism defines mental states by their functional role, rather than their physical composition or metaphysical nature. Pain, for example, is whatever state is typically caused by tissue damage and typically causes avoidance behavior, distress, and desire for relief. This functional definition could be realized in neurons, in silicon chips, or in alien biochemistry. Functionalism's appeal is that it is neither dualist nor crudely reductionist. It acknowledges that mental states are real and distinct from mere physical states, but it does not require immaterial souls. Mental states are functional states, patterns of causal organization. This explains why psychology has its own concepts and laws that are not reducible to neuroscience. Psychology describes functional organization. Neuroscience describes physical implementation. Both levels of description are valid and necessary. Machine functionalism, the strongest version, claims that the mind is to the brain as software is to hardware. Just as the same program can run on different computers, the same mental states could in principle be realized in different physical substrates. This makes artificial intelligence and mind uploading theoretically possible. If minds are programs, we could copy a mind by copying its functional organization into a different medium. This has profound implications for personal identity and survival. However, functionalism faces serious objections. The Chinese room argument, proposed by John Searle, challenges whether functional organization is sufficient for genuine mental states. Imagine a room where someone who does not understand Chinese follows a complex rule book for manipulating Chinese symbols. Input comes in the form of Chinese questions. The person follows rules to generate appropriate Chinese answers, which are output. From outside, the room appears to understand Chinese, answering questions correctly. But clearly, no one in the room understands Chinese. The person just manipulates meaningless symbols according to rules. If the room does not understand Chinese despite having the right functional organization, then functional organization is not sufficient for understanding or genuine mental states. Searle concludes that syntax, rule-following, is not sufficient for semantics, genuine meaning and understanding. Computers manipulate symbols according to rules, implementing functions, but they do not understand anything. They lack intentionality, the aboutness or meaning that characterizes genuine mental states. Therefore, functionalism misses something essential about mind, not just what it does, but what it means and experiences. This brings us back to the hard problem of consciousness. The knowledge argument and zombie thought experiments, which we discussed earlier, pose similar problems for functionalism. You could have a being that is functionally identical to you, processing information and generating behavior in exactly the same way, but without any subjective experience. Philosophical zombies are functionally equivalent to conscious beings, but lack qualia. If zombies are conceivable, then functional organization is not sufficient for consciousness. Something more is needed, the subjective experiential aspect that functionalism seems to leave out. Functionalists respond in various ways. Some deny that zombies are genuinely conceivable, arguing that our intuitions about what is possible are unreliable. Others accept that functionalism needs supplementation with a theory of consciousness. Functional role might determine cognitive and intentional states, but consciousness might require additional explanation. This leads to more complex theories attempting to combine functionalism with accounts of phenomenal consciousness. Representationalism offers one such combination. This view, defended by Fred Dretske, Michael Tye and others, argues that conscious experiences are representational states. To experience red is to represent something as red. Consciousness is a form of intentionality, a way of representing the world. This integrates consciousness with cognitive function. Conscious experiences represent information and guide behavior. The appeal of representationalism is that it makes consciousness less mysterious. Instead of being an ineffable qual floating free of function, Consciousness is integrated into the information processing architecture as a representational format. The redness of red is not a mysterious inner quality, but a way of representing certain wavelengths of light. This preserves the reality of consciousness while making it scientifically tractable. We can study what information conscious states represent and how these representations guide behavior. Critics object that representationalism confuses what experiences represent with what they are like. My experience of red represents certain surface properties of objects, but the subjective redness, the way it feels, seems to be something over and above this representational content. You could imagine inverting the representational content, making red represent what green currently represents, but the phenomenology might remain unchanged. Or you could have accurate representation without any phenomenology at all, as in philosophical zombies. Enactivism offers a more radical departure from traditional frameworks. Developed by philosophers like Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson and Alva Noe, enactivism argues that mind is not something in the head, but something organisms do in active engagement with their environment. Cognition is enacted through sensory-motor interaction with the world. Consciousness is not an internal representation, but a way of being coupled with the environment. For enactivists, the Cartesian picture of mind as an inner realm separate from the outer physical world is fundamentally wrong. Mind is not inner at all. It is the dynamic pattern of organism-environment interaction. Perception is not passive reception of input, but active exploration. You do not see because images form on your retina and are processed by your brain. You see because you actively explore your environment, moving your eyes and head, guided by sensory-motor knowledge of how your movements produce changes in sensory input. This view draws on phenomenology, the philosophical tradition begun by Edmund Husserl that emphasizes first-person description of experience. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a phenomenologist, argued that we are embodied subjects, not pure minds inhabiting bodies as instruments. The body is not something we have, but something we are. Our experience is structured by our bodily engagement with the world. The perceived distance of objects depends on our sense of how we would need to move to reach them. The perceived heaviness of objects depends on our sense of effort needed to lift them. Enactivism challenges both traditional dualism and computational functionalism. Against dualism, it insists mind is not separate from body and world, but is embodied and embedded. Against functionalism, it argues mind is not software running on neural hardware, but dynamic activity involving brain, body, and environment as coupled systems. The unit of analysis is not the individual mind or brain, but the organism-environment system. This makes questions about immaterial souls or mind uploading misconceived, based on false assumptions about what mind is. However, critics argue that enactivism may overreach. While it is true that perception and action are coupled and that cognition is embodied, there still seems to be an inner subjective perspective, a what it is like that is mine and not yours. My consciousness is in some sense within me, not distributed across my interactions with the world. Enactivism may capture important truths about cognition without fully addressing the hard problem of consciousness. Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, takes a mathematical approach to consciousness. IIT proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information measured by a quantity called phi. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information in a unified, irreducible way. High phi means high consciousness. This makes testable predictions and provides a principled way to measure consciousness in animals, patients with brain damage, and potentially artificial systems. IIT has surprising implications. It suggests that consciousness is not an all-or-nothing property, but comes in degrees. Simple systems like thermostats have minimal phi and therefore minimal consciousness. Complex integrated systems like human brains have high phi and rich consciousness. This implies a form of panpsychism. Consciousness exists to some degree in all systems that integrate information, though typically to vanishingly small degrees. IIT also predicts that consciousness cannot be simulated on a conventional computer. Even if a computer simulates every neuron in your brain, it would not be conscious if the simulation is serial rather than parallel, because the integration would be artificial rather than real. Consciousness requires genuine causal integration, not just functional equivalence. This distinguishes IIT from pure functionalism. Critics argue that IIT may change the subject from explaining consciousness to measuring information integration. Even if we grant that consciousness correlates with integrated information, why should integrated information feel like anything? IIT identifies a measurable property that consciousness might possess without explaining why that property is accompanied by subjective experience. It addresses the hard problem, but perhaps does not solve it. Nevertheless, IIT represents progress. It provides a rigorous framework and testable predictions, where previously there were only philosophical intuitions. Panpsychism, once dismissed as mystical nonsense, is being seriously reconsidered by contemporary philosophers. Philip Goff, Galen Strawson, and David Chalmers have defended versions of panpsychism as the best solution to the hard problem. If matter has intrinsic experiential properties at the micro level, then macro-level consciousness is not mysterious emergence from non-consciousness, but combination of micro-consciousnesses. This avoids the apparent impossibility of consciousness arising from wholly non-conscious matter. Russellian monism, a specific form of panpsychism, suggests that physics only describes the relational structure of matter, what things do, not what they intrinsically are. The intrinsic nature of matter might be experiential. An electron's experience is what an electron is from the inside, while its mass and charge describe its external relations to other things. This would make consciousness fundamental to the nature of matter rather than a strange anomaly needing explanation. Mind and matter would be two aspects of the same underlying reality. The combination problem remains panpsychism's greatest challenge. How do micro-experiences of particles combine into the unified macro-experience of a human consciousness? This problem is as difficult as explaining how consciousness emerges from non-consciousness. Some panpsychists argue that combination is less mysterious than emergence, but this is disputed. Others propose that consciousness is not combined from parts, but is a fundamental holistic property of certain complex systems. These contemporary frameworks show that the debate has moved beyond simple dichotomies. The question is not just soul versus materialism, but what kind of materialism, what role for function versus phenomenology, what relationship between brain, body, and environment. No framework has achieved consensus, but the debate is more sophisticated and empirically grounded than ever before. The soul concept in its classical form may be dead, but the questions it addressed remain very much alive. Part 11. Practical Implications. The philosophical debate about the soul is not merely academic, but has profound practical consequences for ethics, law, medicine, and how we live our lives. Understanding these implications helps us see why the question matters beyond intellectual curiosity. Let us begin with criminal justice and moral responsibility. Our legal system assumes that individuals are responsible for their actions and can be justly punished for wrongdoing. This assumption depends on views about free will and personal identity. If you have an immaterial soul that makes free choices independent of physical causation, then you are truly responsible for your actions. You could have chosen otherwise, so punishment is deserved. But if your decisions are entirely determined by brain states, which are determined by genetics, environment, and prior causes, then are you really responsible? If a brain tumor causes someone to commit murder, we consider them less responsible because the tumor affected their brain. But if all behavior is ultimately caused by brain states you did not choose, how is any behavior truly your responsibility? This is the free will problem, intimately connected to the soul question. If the soul is an immaterial agent capable of self-caused action, free will is preserved. If there is no soul and you are just your brain, and your brain is a physical system obeying causal laws, then free will seems threatened. Neuroscience has complicated this picture dramatically. Studies by Benjamin Libet and others found that the brain begins preparing to act several hundred milliseconds before you consciously decide to act. The readiness potential, a pattern of neural activity indicating preparation for movement, precedes conscious intention. This suggests that the unconscious brain decides before the conscious mind knows it has decided. Conscious will might be an after-the-fact illusion, a story the brain tells itself about decisions already made. If this interpretation is correct, it undermines retributive justice. How can we justly punish people for actions they did not freely choose? Some philosophers and legal theorists argue for a more consequentialist approach to criminal justice. Punishment should aim at rehabilitation and deterrence, not retribution. We quarantine dangerous people the way we quarantine infectious diseases, not because they morally deserve it, but to protect society. Others argue that even if actions are determined, responsibility is still appropriate because holding people responsible itself influences behavior. The legal system is part of the causal system shaping actions. The soul question also affects end-of-life ethics profoundly. If you have an immortal soul that persists after death, then death is not the end, but a transition. This might make death less frightening and make certain medical decisions easier. If there is no soul and death is annihilation, complete cessation of existence, this might make prolonging life more urgent or might make acceptance of mortality more important. Different views about the soul support different attitudes toward death and dying. Persistent vegetative state poses a specific ethical dilemma. Patients in vegetative states have sleep-wake cycles and reflexes, but show no signs of consciousness. Their cortex is severely damaged while their brainstem functions. If the soul is the seat of consciousness and personhood, and consciousness is absent, has the person already ceased to exist? Is the body being kept alive without the person? This would support withdrawing life support. But if personhood depends on biological life, or if there is any possibility of consciousness we cannot detect, then the person might still be present, making withdrawal of life support more problematic. Different theories of the soul and personal identity lead to different conclusions about these heartbreaking cases. Brain death is legally recognized as death in most jurisdictions, even though the heart continues beating with mechanical support. This reflects a modern view that the person is essentially the brain or mind, not the biological organism. If your brain is irreversibly destroyed, you are dead even if your body functions. This makes sense if the soul is the mind, or if there is no soul and personhood is a property of functioning brains. But it is controversial from perspectives that see the soul as animating the entire organism. Some religious traditions reject brain death criteria, arguing that death occurs only when the heart stops. Advance directives and living wills raise questions about personal identity over time. You write instructions now about medical care you want if you develop severe dementia. But the person with dementia may have different preferences. If dementia destroys enough psychological continuity, is the demented patient the same person who wrote the directive? Ronald Dworkin argued that our past autonomous self should have authority over our future demented self, even if preferences diverge, because autonomy is important to personhood. Others argue that the present person's interests and preferences should take priority. This debate depends partly on what grounds personal identity, psychological continuity, bodily continuity, or something else. Abortion ethics intersects with the soul question in complex ways. If ensoulment occurs at conception, if a unique individual soul comes into existence when sperm meets egg, then abortion is killing a person from the earliest stages of pregnancy. If ensoulment occurs later, perhaps when the fetus develops consciousness or viability, then early abortion might not involve killing a person. Catholic theology traditionally held that ensoulment occurs at conception, making all abortion murder. But this was not always church doctrine. Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, believed ensoulment occurred later in pregnancy, when the fetus developed sufficiently to receive a rational soul. Modern biology shows that development is gradual and continuous, with no clear moment when personhood obviously begins. Even without religious concepts of ensoulment, the abortion debate involves questions about personhood and moral status. What properties make something a person with a right to life? Consciousness, self-awareness, rationality, capacity for relationships. Early fetuses lack these properties, but have the potential to develop them. Does potential personhood have moral weight? These questions parallel traditional debates about when the soul enters the body. Animal consciousness and animal ethics also depend on views about the soul. If only humans have immortal rational souls, as Descartes believed, then animals might be mere machines incapable of genuine suffering. This would make animal experimentation and factory farming morally unproblematic. But if animals have consciousness and can suffer even if they lack rational souls, then we have moral duties toward them. Modern biology makes clear that mammals have similar brain structures supporting emotion and pain perception. They are not Cartesian automata. The question of which animals are conscious and to what degree remains open. Mammals clearly are conscious. But what about birds, fish, insects, or more exotic cases like octopuses whose intelligence evolved separately from vertebrates? Where we draw the line affects which animals deserve moral consideration. This is a modern version of the medieval debate about which beings have souls. Artificial intelligence raises perhaps the most futuristic practical implications. Could a sufficiently sophisticated AI be conscious? If consciousness requires a soul, and souls are immaterial substances only God creates, then no AI could be conscious. If consciousness is a functional property that can be realized in silicon as well as neurons, then sufficiently advanced AI might be conscious. If consciousness requires specific biological properties or depends on quantum effects in microtubules, as some theories propose, then silicon-based AI might never be conscious, no matter how sophisticated. This matters because conscious AI would have moral status. Creating and deleting conscious AIs might be morally equivalent to creating and killing people. Enslaving conscious AIs to do our bidding might be wrong. But if AI is not conscious, just sophisticated information processing without subjective experience, then we have no more moral duty to AI than to calculators. The difference is profound, but how would we know? If we cannot even agree on whether insects are conscious, how will we determine if AI is conscious? Mind uploading, copying a human brain's information into a computer, raises identity questions. If you could upload your brain scan to a computer, would the resulting digital entity be you? If consciousness is a program, then yes, you might survive as software. But if personal identity requires bodily or biological continuity, the upload would be a copy, not you. The original you would still die, while a new person with your memories wakes up in the computer. This is not survival, but replication. Even if uploading preserves identity, the gradual replacement problem remains. If neurons were replaced with functionally identical artificial neurons one at a time, most people think you would survive throughout the process, eventually becoming a wholly artificial brain. But if the biological brain is shut down and a functionally identical artificial brain is switched on, intuitions differ. Is the gradual process different from the sudden replacement? Does personal identity depend on continuity of physical substrate, continuity of function, or something else? These are modern versions of the ship of Theseus problem. Ancient philosophy's puzzle about identity through replacement of parts. Medical decisions about organ donation intersect with the soul question. If the soul departs at brain death, then harvesting organs from brain-dead patients does not harm the person who has already ceased to exist. But if the soul remains as long as biological life continues, organ harvesting might kill the donor. Different religious traditions hold different views on this, affecting willingness to donate or accept organs. Understanding these views is important for respecting patient autonomy and family wishes. The soul question also affects personal meaning and how we face mortality. Belief in an immortal soul can provide comfort in the face of death and give ultimate meaning to life. If this life is preparation for eternity, then present suffering might be bearable as temporary. Lack of such belief can make this life feel more precious and urgent, since it is all we have. Or it can seem to rob life of ultimate meaning if everything ends in oblivion. These are not just theoretical views, but deeply personal perspectives affecting how we live and what we value. The soul question is ultimately existential, about the meaning of being human. Part 12. Where the concept fails and what remains unresolved. After this comprehensive investigation, we must honestly assess where the concept of the soul succeeds and where it fails. Intellectual integrity requires acknowledging the genuine insights and enduring problems the concept addresses, while also recognizing its limitations and the reasons many thinkers reject it. The classical soul concept fails most clearly as scientific explanation. The hypothesis that an immaterial substance thinks, feels, and makes decisions is empirically unproductive. It generates no testable predictions that neuroscience does not already explain better. Every aspect of mental life investigated so far has been found to depend on specific brain structures and processes. Damage to the brain predictably damages the mind. Alterations to brain chemistry predictably alter consciousness and personality. The correlation between brain states and mental states is so tight and consistent that positing an additional immaterial cause adds nothing explanatory. This is Occam's razor at work. The soul is an unnecessary hypothesis. The interaction problem, identified by Princess Elizabeth nearly 400 years ago, remains unsolved and perhaps unsolvable. If the soul is genuinely immaterial, existing outside physical space and time, it cannot causally interact with physical things. Causation requires some point of contact, some shared nature between cause and effect. All observed causation involves spatial, temporal, and energetic relationships. An immaterial soul has none of these properties. How could it cause neurons to fire or be affected by sensory input? Attempts to solve this through occasionalism or pre-established harmony are philosophically desperate. They preserve the soul concept only by making it causally impotent, which defeats the purpose. The soul was supposed to explain agency, how we make things happen. If God does all the actual causing and the soul is just along for the ride, the soul has become explanatorily useless. It is like saying the soul exists but does nothing. This is an admission of defeat disguised as a solution. The soul concept also fails to account for the gradual evolution of mind. Human mental capacities evolved gradually from simpler animal minds. At no point in evolutionary history did an immaterial soul suddenly appear. Consciousness exists in degrees across species, from the minimal awareness of simpler organisms to the rich, self-reflective consciousness of humans. This continuum is exactly what evolutionary biology predicts, but hard to reconcile with the idea of an immaterial soul as a discrete all-or-nothing entity. Moreover, individual development shows similar gradualness. Human infants gradually develop consciousness, self-awareness, and rational thought as their brains mature. Mental capacities correlate precisely with brain development. This makes sense if mind is what brain does, but is puzzling if the soul is present from conception as a complete immaterial agent. Why would an immaterial rational soul need to wait for brain myelination to think rationally? The evidence from split brain cases, which we discussed earlier, poses an insurmountable problem for the traditional soul concept. If the soul is simple and indivisible, it cannot be split by severing physical connections. Yet consciousness clearly fragments when the corpus callosum is cut. Each hemisphere processes information and directs behavior independently, sometimes with conflicting preferences and beliefs. Either there are two souls, which contradicts the indivisibility claim, or the unified soul somehow became divided, which contradicts its immateriality, or the sense of unified selfhood is not produced by an indivisible soul, but by integrated brain activity. The third option is the only one consistent with the evidence. The soul concept also fails to explain the relationship between consciousness and attention. When you attend to something, you become conscious of it. When attention lapses, things happen outside consciousness. This tight connection between attention and consciousness makes sense if consciousness is a brain process involving attention mechanisms. It is harder to explain if consciousness is produced by an immaterial soul. Why would the soul's consciousness depend on what the brain is attending to? Similarly, the soul concept struggles with unconscious mental processes. Much of mental life is unconscious: memory consolidation during sleep, implicit biases affecting judgment, emotional reactions before conscious awareness, split attention allowing driving while thinking about something else. If the soul is the subject of consciousness, what is the status of unconscious mental processes? Are they not in the soul? Then where are they? If they are in the soul, why are we not conscious of them? The brain-based view handles this easily. Some brain processes are conscious and others are not, depending on whether they meet certain conditions like global availability or high-level integration. The placebo effect provides another challenge. Belief alone can produce measurable physiological changes: pain relief, immune system modulation, even changes in Parkinson's symptoms. If the soul is immaterial, how could it affect physical processes so specifically? The brain-based explanation is straightforward. Beliefs are brain states, and brain states regulate other brain states and bodily processes through neural and hormonal pathways. The soul-based explanation requires mysterious soul-to-body causation that violates physical principles. Where does this leave us? The classical soul concept has failed as scientific explanation, but the problems it addressed have not been solved. Consciousness remains deeply mysterious. We still do not know why there is subjective experience, why information processing in the brain produces an inner mental life. We still do not fully understand personal identity. What makes you the same person over time, despite constant change? We still do not understand how physical processes can be about things, how thoughts can have meaning and refer to objects. These are the hard problems that motivated the soul concept in the first place. Materialism has won the scientific debate, but not the philosophical debate. It is the best scientific framework we have. Any complete explanation of mind will be consistent with physics and neuroscience. But materialism has not explained consciousness. It has only described neural correlates. Correlation is not explanation. Knowing which brain states correspond to which experiences does not tell us why those brain states are accompanied by experience at all. The explanatory gap remains. There seems to be something it is like to be conscious that is not captured by any physical description. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the whatness of any experience seems to be left out by neuroscience. Perhaps this is an illusion of perspective, and complete neuroscience would dissolve the mystery. Or perhaps consciousness is genuinely irreducible, a fundamental feature of reality that cannot be explained in other terms. If consciousness is fundamental as panpsychism and idealism suggest, this does not vindicate the classical soul concept, but it does show that pure materialism is incomplete. Reality might have intrinsic mental properties alongside or instead of purely physical properties. Mind might not be reducible to matter, because matter itself has a mental aspect. This is not the immaterial soul of classical philosophy, but it preserves the insight that consciousness is not just another physical property like mass or charge. The soul concept also got something right about agency and moral responsibility. We do experience ourselves as agents who deliberate and choose. This experience is central to human life and ethics. Even if this agency is ultimately grounded in brain processes, even if free will is an illusion or needs to be reconceptualized, the phenomenology of agency is real and important. The soul concept captured this phenomenology by positing an immaterial agent. We need better concepts, but we cannot simply dismiss the agency problem. Personal identity over time remains unsolved. No theory fully captures our intuitions about what makes you you across time. Psychological continuity theories face the circularity problem and the fission problem. Bodily continuity theories face transplant cases and gradual replacement problems. The soul provided a simple answer. You are the same person because you have the same soul. This answer fails for the reasons we discussed, but the problem it addressed remains. Perhaps personal identity is not a deep metaphysical fact, but a practical construct. We might draw identity boundaries differently for different purposes without any single correct answer. This would mean the soul concept failed, partly because it sought a deep metaphysical answer to a question that lacks one. But even if identity is conventional, we need to understand what conventions are appropriate and why. The debate continues. The value question also remains. What makes persons valuable? What grounds human dignity and rights? The soul concept provided a clear answer. Humans have special value because they have immortal rational souls made in God's image. Without this foundation, we need alternative grounds for human value. Some philosophers argue that consciousness and capacity for suffering ground moral status. Others argue that rationality and autonomy do. Still others argue that being human, a member of our biological species, is what matters. Each view has implications for animal rights, abortion ethics, treatment of the severely disabled, and artificial intelligence. The mortality question cannot be avoided. Does something of us survive death? The neuroscience evidence strongly suggests not. When the brain dies, the person ceases to exist. But we cannot be absolutely certain. Consciousness depends on the brain as far as we can tell, but whether consciousness could exist without a brain remains an open possibility. Near-death experiences, though likely explainable as brain states during dying, at least raise questions. The honest answer is that we do not know what happens after death. The soul concept offered certainty, but that certainty was false. We face mortality with uncertainty. This might be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not an argument. Truth does not care what we wish were true. If evidence points toward mortality being the end of personal existence, we must face this honestly rather than retreating into comforting fictions. At the same time, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Science investigates the physical world and has found no evidence of immaterial souls or afterlife. But this does not prove they do not exist. It just means we have no good reason to believe they do. What remains unresolved is whether entirely new frameworks might emerge that explain consciousness without reducing it to mere brain activity, but also without invoking immaterial souls. Quantum theories of consciousness, though speculative, suggest that quantum coherence in microtubules might be crucial for consciousness. If true, this would mean consciousness depends on quantum processes, not just classical neural activity. This does not make consciousness immaterial, but it might make it irreducible in interesting ways. Information-theoretic approaches like integrated information theory treat consciousness as a fundamental property of certain information structures. This is neither classical materialism nor dualism, but a different framework entirely. Whether it succeeds remains to be seen. The emergence of new science might require new metaphysics. Just as quantum mechanics required revising classical notions of causation and determinism, understanding consciousness might require revising our ontology, our categories for what exists. The soul concept might have been wrong while also being right, that consciousness does not fit easily into a purely materialist framework. Where does this leave practical people trying to live their lives? The soul concept's failure as scientific explanation does not make life meaningless or ethics arbitrary. Consciousness is real whether or not it involves an immaterial soul. Your experiences matter whether they are produced by a soul or by neurons. Persons have value whether this value comes from having souls or from being conscious, rational, social beings. Morality does not depend on the soul. We have duties to each other because we can suffer and flourish, because we are vulnerable and need cooperation, because empathy and fairness enable us to live together. These are sufficient grounds for ethics. Religion and belief in the soul may reinforce morality, but they are not its foundation. Secular ethics based on human well-being, autonomy and flourishing can be just as robust as religious ethics. Death becomes neither less nor more frightening without the soul concept. If death is the end, life becomes more precious. Every moment matters because there are only finitely many. If death is not the end, if consciousness continues in some form we do not understand, then life is still precious as the foundation for whatever comes next. Either way, we should live well. The examined life remains worthwhile. Understanding yourself, grappling with difficult questions, seeking truth even when uncomfortable, these are valuable whether or not you have an immortal soul. Philosophy's goal is not to provide comforting answers, but to pursue truth wherever it leads. The soul concept has led us through 25 centuries of profound thought, illuminating deep questions about consciousness, identity, agency, and mortality. We now know the soul as classically conceived almost certainly does not exist. But the questions it addressed remain among philosophy's deepest and most important. We continue the investigation with better tools, more evidence, and humbler expectations. Perhaps future generations will look back at our current materialism the way we look back at Cartesian dualism, as a step forward, but not the final answer. Or perhaps materialism, properly understood and developed, will prove adequate to explain all mental phenomena. The honest conclusion is that we do not yet know. The soul debate has transformed into the mind-body problem, the problem of consciousness, the problem of personal identity. These problems are not solved. They may never be completely solved, or they may be solved in ways we cannot yet imagine. This is not failure, but the nature of deep philosophical investigation. We continue to seek understanding, knowing that complete understanding may elude us, but also knowing that the pursuit itself is valuable and human.